Donald Trump Jr. spent about 5 hours with staff at the Senate Judiciary Committee answering questions about a meeting he says lasted about 20 minutes. It was last summer at Trump Tower here in New York when he, then campaign chairman Paul Manafort, and current senior White House advisor Jared Kushner met with 5 others, including a Russian lawyer and a Russian-American lobbyist. After leaving the Capitol today, the president's son released a statement saying, in part, "I answered every question posed by the committee related to this topic, as well as all of their questions on other topics until both sides had exhausted their lines of questioning. I trust this interview fully satisfied their inquiry." More on that in a bit. Compare that description of the meeting with Democratic Senator Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut, who called the tone of today cordial, but went on to say this.
He left more questions unanswered than he answered. There were gaping holes in the information that he provided, which is why we need to have him come back in public under oath in a hearing of the Judiciary Committee. But he left nothing to dispel my impression that that June 9th meeting essentially signaled to the Russians, we're open for business, we're ready to deal.
Trump Jr. wrote a prepared statement for the committee. In it, he mentioned many of his father's primary victories and noted that the man who set up the meeting once worked with Michael Jackson. He also wrote, quote, "Because my father started off as the underdog, we had a very modest staff and were forced to learn as we went along." And he described June 2016 as an extraordinarily intense period of time, chaotic, in fact. He also elaborated on why he agreed to the meeting, saying, quote, "To the extent they had information concerning the fitness, character, or qualifications of a presidential candidate, I believe that I should at least hear them out." Here's what to know about his appearance today. His testimony lasted, as we said, 5 hours. It was not under oath. It was transcribed, and it's possible that transcript could eventually be released. He was questioned only by the committee staff. Senators could attend but not participate. 7 senators, in fact, did choose to sit in on at least part of the meeting, some of them for just a few minutes, some of them for much longer. 6 of them are Democrats. One of those, Chris Coons of Delaware, put out a statement afterward without much context or explanation, and that's why it got a lot of attention. Quote, "It is important to remember that anyone who testifies in front of a Senate committee is under the restrictions of the false statement statute that says material false statements to Congress are criminal and punishable with fines or imprisonment or both." The judiciary investigation, one of 3 going on concurrently on Capitol Hill. Today, the California Democratic Senator Kamala Harris, a member of the Intelligence Committee, spoke to our own Ari Melber about that investigation and did not rule out the possibility of seeing the president himself testify as part of this Russia investigation.
Is the testimony or potential hearing with the president, Donald Trump, off the table for this investigation?
Yeah.
So it's possible that the Senate could seek his testimony?
I think it's possible, yes.
Under what conditions?
We'll see where the facts lead us.
With that, and on that note, let's bring in tonight's starting panel. Michael Crowley, senior foreign affairs correspondent for Politico, is with us. Julie Pace, Washington bureau chief for the Associated Press, is back with us. And with us here in the studio, former assistant special Watergate counsel, attorney Nick Ackerman. Julie, we'll start with you. And at the risk of going over already plowed ground, how many versions of the Donald Trump Jr. story have there been? And take us back to that Air Force One flight, coming back from the G20. Why was that so important? What emanated from the plane, and why that's going to come back, it looks like, continually to haunt the Trump camp?
That plane conversation certainly is going to be something that we're going to hear more about in the coming months. But to talk about this version of this June meeting that we heard today, the version that Don Jr. talked about in his opening statement and we're told in his 5 hours of testimony before these Senate staffers was certainly a more sober version. He talked about seeking information, perhaps on Hillary Clinton's fitness for office, her character. This was not the tone that he struck in those emails that were released. That when he was discussing this meeting in real time, when he was talking about loving the idea that he might be able to get some dirt on Hillary Clinton, he was almost presenting himself in this case as just almost a concerned American, talking about how he would have gone to law enforcement had he actually received this type of information. So on his part, this was an attempt to reshape the narrative around this meeting, to put it in a much different light. But that is difficult to do given the fact that we have his own words from his emails that he was putting out there, but that were happening in real time, where he was certainly excited about the prospect of getting information from a Russian attorney.
Like everybody in Washington these days, luckily we brought a lawyer to this meeting tonight. So, Counselor, the next question goes to you. Number one, someone named Trump today took questions from a Senate committee. So that tells us this was of moment. There are real consequences for getting the story wrong, for not telling the truth. Tell me, in your view, knowing what we know about roughly was discussed there and his own statement, where's the jeopardy from today?
Well, the jeopardy is that he could be prosecuted for lying to the Congress. It's a 5-year felony. It's a very, very serious matter. And if you look at that statement, I mean, it was obviously drafted by an attorney. He was prepared by an attorney. The defenses that are raised in there are the very typical things you expect to see in a white-collar case. It was the old, I'm too busy defense. I'm too busy running a campaign. I'm too busy running the business. I really don't remember. I was in the middle of a maelstrom. I didn't really pay attention to any of this, and I didn't take it very seriously. That was the major defense that came out of this. But there are some nuggets in this entire statement that I find really significant. And I think the most significant one is when he actually admits that the Russian lawyer talked about donors to the Hillary Clinton campaign and information that they had from the Democratic National Committee. Now, if we put that in context, this meeting occurred not too long after we know that the Russians were hacking into the Democratic National Committee and taking documents out of there. And so I think what he has done is he's tried to inoculate himself from a perjury and a false statement claim by giving some kind of very nebulous statements about what was discussed, because he knows that there are at least 7 other people that were in attendance at that meeting, not all of whom he can control.
Yeah.
So he has to be very careful. So by kind of giving a very sort of nebulous statement, however, there's enough detail there to make you wonder, were they really talking about the information and about the emails that were hacked out of the Hillary Clinton headquarters? Now, he goes on to say, oh, I don't remember anybody leaving any documents behind. I don't recall what was said, and I couldn't understand her, even though there was an interpreter there, a translator that would have translated from Russian to English. So there are some nuggets in here that raise a lot of serious questions.
All right, Michael, we've lawyered up. Talk about the damage from a series of rolling multiple stories.
So, Brian, we've already covered the fact that this is something like his 4th version of what happened. And I think it brings you back to a big point about the way this story is unfolded, which is that the White House keeps saying the press is obsessed with the Russia story. There's nothing to see here. You know, there's no smoking gun. Why can't we move on? Why can't you let it go? And the fact is that if the responses from Trump officials from the White House stood up to any scrutiny, and if the first explanation for a meeting like this was the last explanation and the right explanation, I think people might be willing to say, okay, maybe we'll give you the benefit of the doubt. But none of these stories are standing up. I mean, we go all the way back to, you know, Mike Pence's shifting accounts of interactions with Michael Flynn. There are a bunch of other examples you can name where the explanations aren't solid, they don't stand up, and there's just a huge credibility problem here. So this is why it's totally understandable that Congress keeps calling people in, spends up to 5 hours asking them very detailed questions. It's possible now that Donald Trump Jr. is going to come back and be asked more questions, possibly even in a public setting, which is going to be one of the most dramatic days of this presidency if it happens. there's just a huge credibility problem here, and this is the latest example of that.
Well, Julie, take on that last point. What are the chances, do you think, this may call for an opinion or judgment on your part, that we're going to see the president's son, lights, camera, action, live all day on networks like this one?
Well, I think you saw two strategies playing out today on that front. On the one hand, you had Don Jr. saying in a statement after the meeting, basically that he answered every question that was asked of him, and he feels like that should satisfy the needs of this committee. That was his way of saying, I don't really want to go before the cameras. I think I've done my job here. But then what you saw from Democrats was them coming out saying, no, actually, we have more questions. We feel like he didn't give us a full picture of this meeting. I think some of that is simply strategy on their part, because they do want him to answer what he said behind closed doors in public. There's an accountability aspect of it, but certainly there's a theatrical aspect of it as well. As Michael said, this would be one of the most dramatic days of the president's tenure if his son were to be in public before cameras and lawmakers answering questions about his interactions with a Russian attorney during the campaign.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.